Have you been put off sewing with knits because you feel like they need special tools or equipment? Watch this video and I will give you my top 10 tips for sewing with knits with confidence. Hi everybody, welcome to my channel, Frugalisama. My name's Sam. This is where I talk about all things sewing. Today is day 53 of 100 days of sewing, and I'm going to give you my top 10 tips of how to sew with knits. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone who's subscribed so far. I seem to have got a lot of new subscribers recently, so thank you very much for everyone who has done so. Just helps YouTube show my videos to new people, the more subscribers and notification bells that are hit. So if this is the sort of thing that you like and you haven't subscribed already, I've got lots more videos coming for you, and I record usually on a Friday with Frugal Friday. Midweek I try to put a tutorial or a tips and tricks video out like this, and then on a Sunday usually plans, makes and reviews and that sort of thing. If that's the sort of thing that you like, please like or comment or subscribe, and if you hit the notification bell it will tell you when I've got new videos out. So on to today's video. So if you have a look in your wardrobe, I'm quite willing to bet that you've got quite a lot of knit garments in there, from your jogging pants to your t-shirts, sleepwear, exercise wear, and that's because it's comfortable. And the reason it's comfortable is that it's got a bit of stretch to it. So most fabrics will come into two categories, not all of them, but there are some subcategories, but they're either knit or woven. So a woven fabric is constructed by weaving multiple yarns, and they are usually crossing each other, something like that, at right angles usually, but depending on the weave. Whereas a knit fabric is made up with a single piece of yarn, and it is just knitted just like you would see a piece of knitting. My best example is this Mandy boat tee here, and if you look really closely you can actually see that it's knit, and it's very similar to any jumpers that you might have that's been hand knit. It's produced in the same way, obviously on a larger scale. And the best way to test if you're in a fabric shop and you're wanting to know whether it's a knit or woven is just to grab the fabric, and if it stretches easily like that, then you're dealing with a knit, and if it doesn't stretch easily like that, then you're dealing with a woven. Now you do have some knits that don't give a lot of stretch, so we'll talk a little bit more about stretch later. So the number one question that I see being asked about sewing with knits is, do you need a serger or an overlocker? And the short answer is absolutely not, no. You can sew with knits absolutely fine on a normal basic sewing machine. All you need really is for that sewing machine to be able to do a zigzag stitch so that you can get a little bit of stretch into your seams, but you certainly don't need an overlocker. In fact, I didn't get an overlocker until about 6 or 7 years ago, and I managed just fine without one then. Mine is the basic Singer model that you can buy from Lidl in the UK here. It's a 14SH754, and I've done a full review of that machine as well. And that's served me absolutely fine for my purposes. I've sewn just about everything on that overlocker, knits as well as wovens. For domestic purposes, you absolutely do not need an overlocker. If you do get one, you don't need to get an old singing and dancing one. Just make do with what you've got, and I really wouldn't advise on buying an overlocker or a serger if you've just started sewing until you know that sewing's going to be the hobby for you. They certainly make things faster. Once you've got a little bit more experience, you can sew straight onto an overlocker or a serger. I would never say that you need to have an overlocker when you first start sewing. All that being said, here are my top 10 tips. So the first is to read the instructions on the pattern. Now I know it sounds obvious. What you're specifically looking for is the type of fabric that's being recommended and the amount of stretch that's being recommended as well. Most pattern companies do include this, including the big four amongst this, as well as the independent pattern companies. This is a new look pattern, and right down here can you see there is a stretch guide, and there's also the suggested fabrics on here, which is suggesting an interlock, a jacquard, a jersey, a single knit with a two-way stretch. So just give the back of the packet a read, and with an independent pattern designer the information is almost always there. So ignore this advice at your peril if you've never sewn with knits before. Once you've got a little bit of experience under your belt, by all means play about with different fabrics and what have you, just to get a different look. But if it's your first time sewing with knits, I would definitely advise your first number one top tip is to read that pattern and take note of what the kind of fabric that they're asking for and more specifically the amount of stretch that they're asking for. So that leads me on to my second top tip, and one that took me quite a while to learn for myself, and that is that not all knit fabrics are equal. By that I mean that they will probably all respond and sew up quite differently. I will do a deep dive into different knit fabrics in a different video, but this one I want to keep it relatively short. For now you just need to know that they all have different qualities. So I've got a big pile here of different sorts of knits, different substrates and different weights. They will all sort of sew up differently depending on what it is that you're trying to make. So a good example is this Galaxy t-shirt that I'm wearing here. This was made with a medium weight cotton jersey, and it did require a medium weight cotton jersey because it's got some gathers on the sleeves here. If I'd have tried to make it with a double knit like this ponte that I've got here, I would have had a devil of a job trying to do all the gathers at the top here and into here. And by the same token, if I'd have made it with this viscose jersey that this Vera dress is made with, it would have flopped on these sleeves here. That's not to say that it's wrong. If you want to intentionally do that, then that's absolutely fine. If you don't want such a big poof sleeve, then you would go for something like this. But it will affect how things sew, and it will also affect how things fit as well. So you just need to be aware of that. And also whether something's going to go over your head or not. So my point is that if you make up the garment in the required fabric once and then come back to it in a couple of months' time using whatever, some random fabric that you found in your stash, you don't know what it is, don't expect the same results. You might find that it doesn't fit as well, or that you struggle with it going over your head or something like that. I've learnt the hard way with that one. So that leads me on to number 3, and that is stretch and recovery. What are they talking about with stretch and recovery? So essentially, when you knit something, it does give something an inherent stretch. And the amount of stretch that a pattern is asking for is quite significant. If I tried to make this polo neck, which is a Nina from Seamwork, it's something that didn't have the required stretch in it, I wouldn't be able to get it over my head. The same for the sleeves on this Vera. I've known a few people that have made the Vera top up. You don't need the stretch to go over the head because you've got a V-neck here, but you do need it for these cuffs. These cuffs are very narrow and you do need it to get over your hands. So what do they mean by stretch? Well, the patterns usually come with this. It's called a pick and knit rule. And what they're suggesting is that you get a piece of fabric this size and it should stretch out to that size. So it doesn't actually say on this pattern what stretch it is required, but by measuring that and then onto there, that's 10 centimetres, that's 15. I know that they're asking for 50% stretch. So simply what you do is take your fabric, cut it to the right size, and then bring it out and stretch it to make sure it gets that 50% stretch. And can you see when I've let go there, it's just pinging back, and that's your recovery. When you stretch something out, how well is it stretching back into place after it's been stretched out? And that's quite important, really. Things with a higher elastane content will probably recover a lot better than something like this cotton jersey. This might have a tendency to stretch out. It depends on the elastane content. But if you've ever had a pair of leggings that go baggy at the knees, that's what they're talking about with recovery. It's not a desired look. It's not to say that a fabric's a bad fabric if it doesn't recover well. It's just probably not suitable for certain things. So two-way stretch just means that the fabric will go horizontally from selvage to selvage, that it stretches two-way. It's a little bit misleading calling it two-way stretch because you think horizontal's just one way. Four-way stretch is if it will stretch that way and it will stretch that way as well. So this is stretching that way a little bit, but you can see not quite as much as it is horizontally. So that's your four-way stretch, horizontally and vertically. Two-way stretch is just horizontally, usually. Sometimes it might be horizontal, not desired really. You want a horizontal stretch usually to go over your boobs. If you're sewing a top that's a little bit tight, you want something to go over your boobs. You want a four-way stretch to go over something that, like your backside or your knees or something like that, where you're bending or moving about. So exercise gear is a perfect example. So think lycra tights or something like that. Now, I picked this up thinking that this would be a 4-way stretch. It just looks like it should be. So you've got your horizontal stretch there, but very little stretch that way. So I actually bought this for swimwear, but it's not really suitable because you want swimwear to be able to stretch down your body. You want it very tight, fitting, and you want to stretch across your body as well. So it's just something to look out for. So recovery basically is just describing how a fabric will go back to how it was before it was stretched out. And you've got your 2-way stretch and you've got your 4-way stretch, and then you just need to look out for the percentage of stretch. So generally something like a ribbon, like this one here, will have quite a lot of stretch. It's not great on recovery, isn't this one? Like I say, it's not that it's a bad fabric, it's just not something that you want that's going to go around my knees or anything like that, but fantastic for going around cuffs and around necklines and things like that, because it will stretch out over your hand and then it'll come back and hug you on the wrist. Ribbon and elastane content will do that. So my 4th top tip is to mark the right and wrong side before you start. I can't tell you the amount of time I've wasted trying to discern which is the right and the wrong side. Absolutely fine for something like this one here, where you've got the stars on one side and it's plain on the other side. You can quite plainly see which is which there. Not quite so easily on a black or a dark blue, especially something finely knit like this. So I would suggest that once you've got your fabric on the table to cut out, really clearly mark it. I've used the masking tape method here, and I've actually labelled it as well, so it's just good opportunity when you've got backs and fronts that are very similar to label them. Sometimes it's quite difficult to tell the top and the bottom as well, so just have a method of labelling or marking the rights and the wrong sides. Saves you an awful lot of time. I have got a little video on how to use the masking tape as well. That's one way of doing it. Red pin. That's another way of doing it, sticking a red pin on the wrong side. Just be careful using pins on some knits because you can snag, or just using your chalk or whatever to be able to tell. There is a right and a wrong side. A lot of people will tell you that there's no right. If you can't tell there's no right or wrong side, there is a right and a wrong side. And I can tell you now that I've used the wrong side in the past as well. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent, but there is a right and there is a wrong side. So the right side looks like it's been knit. So if you grab a hand knit jumper out of your wardrobe and it's been knit, you'll have a knit side and a purl side. So the right side is a knit side and the wrong side is a purl side. So that will save you hours of misery. So if you've got access to a magnifying glass, or you might have a magnifier on your phone as well. I know on the iPhone, if you click the home button 3 times, it brings up a magnifier. There's a top tip. There's a free top tip for you, just so that you can see a little bit more closely if you're struggling. But if you have a system, whatever system works for you, put your right sides together, then you've got your wrong sides facing you, and you can put your markings on as well. So it just saves a little bit of time. So tip number 5 is to always pre-wash. Whatever you're making, you should always pre-wash. But I would say with knit fabrics, I think sometimes people are tempted to skip that bit, and I wouldn't, especially if you're using natural fibres, so cotton or a viscose or like a wool jersey or something like that. You need to wash it in the same way that you would launder it when it's made up into a garment. Last thing you want to do is make something that's quite fitted, chuck it in the washing machine and then it shrinks. Or the colour, if it's not colour fast as well. I have had some highly dyed cotton jersey that the dyes run on as well. Now if you're mixing 2 fabrics, you're using a contrast cuff and a neckline, you really don't want your darker fabric to run onto a lighter fabric. So wash it all, pre-wash it all. I would say that about every garment that you're making. I know some people like to miss it. It doesn't take time, and it's something that I do as soon as fabric comes through the door. The same goes for tumble drying as well. If that's your preferred method of washing and drying things, then I would say wash it and tumble dry it as well, but especially for natural fibres. Right, so we're actually on to some sewing. You might have noticed my first 5 tips are all in preparation, and I think preparation is key with sewing with knits. Really don't want to put anybody off. It's not scary. It's just to make life easier for yourself. One of the biggest things with sewing with knits is skip stitches. I have done a full video about how to deal with skip stitches, and the long and short of it is to use the right needle for the job. And the right needle for the job on sewing with knits is generally a ballpoint needle. A ballpoint needle is a little bit rounded on the edge and it won't pierce your fabric. which can potentially cause ladders. You can use a stretch needle. I think a stretch needle really ideally is actually designed for a woven fabric that's got elastane in it. So think about like a stretch denim or something like that. That should also work on a knit fabric as well. So if push comes to shove, a universal needle should also work as well, because that's why they're called universal. It should work with both knits and wovens. But that's down to your needle size, and it's down to the fabric that you're working with as well. So in an ideal world, a ballpoint needle, and again you can get these in different needle sizes, so don't expect a number 70 to work on a really thick fabric like a boiled wool or something like that, and don't try and use a big one on a really fine single cotton jersey. Same rules apply. That is your main reason for skipped stitches, is using the wrong needle. If you're finding that's happening, then change your needles. But did you know that you can get pins that are ballpoint as well as your needles? Now, if you're anything like me, this is a waste of time, because all my pins end up all on one thing like this. I've never used them. If you are concerned about piercing into your fabric with pins, you can actually just use binding clips. These quilters binding clips work just fine. That holds things together. Another way is just to make sure that you pin within the seam allowance, so that you shouldn't have an issue then. And likewise, number 7 is your thread. The recommended thread to use for a knit fabric is a 100% polyester. That's because it's strong. If you're sewing seams that require a little bit of stretching, you don't want your thread to break really easily. A cotton thread will break more easily than a nylon thread. And if you've got some thread that you're not sure what it is, the best way to tell is a cotton thread will have a little bit of a fuzz on it. This hasn't got any labels on it. I've just picked it up from a local market, no doubt. But you can see that there is a fine fuzz. Can you see that? Whereas the polyester thread is much finer spun. And it is, you know, you can see a little bit of lint coming off it, but that's probably the best way to tell. So yeah, a polyester thread is a little bit stronger, and it's the recommended thread. I'll be honest, I don't always do as I'm told. I'm more likely to use one that matches than one that doesn't. So I can be a bit naughty, and I think that's where experience comes in. But again, if you're finding that your threads are breaking or your stitches are skipping, that could be an explanation for it. So my 8th tip is stitch options. Often a pattern will actually suggest what kind of stitch to use. Particularly your independent patterns, they will probably give you a suggestion of what length to go for. So in seams that aren't going to stretch, you don't really need to use any kind of specialist stitch at all. But if you've got on your shoulder seams or something that's going to get stretched out, like a neckline like this is going to get stretched to go over my head. A neckline like that probably isn't. And once again, it depends on, you know, like if you're making leggings or something like that, where the stitches might pop with a lot of bending and moving about, then a stitch that stretches is far better than a stitch that doesn't stretch. And a stitch that stretches on my machine is a lightning stitch. But it's an absolute pig to unpick. So don't go straight in with a lightning stitch if you're not sure about fit. I would say baste it first. That is my top tip with stitches. If you're making a pair of leggings that are going round your backside, you really do need that extra strength. But if you're not sure that it's going to fit first, I would just baste it first. Otherwise, most seams are okay on a narrow zigzag stitch. I'll bob in the numbers that I use. Like I say, check your pattern. There might be some sort of suggestion on there. I know Tilly in the buttons is pretty good at sort of suggesting what stitch length to use. For the needles and the thread and the stitch length, I would say test again. So grab yourself a scrap piece of fabric, of the fabric that you're using. Double it over, because you will be sewing through 2 lots of fabric. And test out your thread, test out your needles, and test out the stitch length. Do it on quite a long bit of fabric as well. And if you're testing out such as your hem, you want to be sewing in the direction that you would be in your hem. You will be sewing kind of selvage to selvage on a hem. So there's no point sewing it the other way around. You need to be testing it on the way that you're going to be sewing it, and then give it a pull on your fabric to make sure that that stitch is going to hold. You'll have a fair idea then whether the stitches are going to skip and whether you've got the right needle in and whether you've got the right thread in. If you find that your stitches are skipping, 9 times out of 10 it's because you've got the wrong needle. So you just need to swap out your needle. Also, check your manual for your sewing machine. You might find that there's lots of advice in there as well. So my 9th tip is stabilising the shoulder seam, and it's usually in the instructions here, but sometimes they miss it out, and depending on the weight that's going to be carried, as you can see this dress here, all the weight of the dress is being carried on this shoulder seam here, so you don't want it to stretch out, so you want something in there to stabilise it. So usually a little bit of interfacing is absolutely fine, that will do the job. If you've not got any interfacing, you can use a little bit of twill tape or a little bit of ribbon or something like that. This Galaxy tee is actually top stitched along the shoulder seam, which is quite unusual. This Greco tee has a little bit of binding. It's not bias binding, it's on the grain. It covers up the neckline and goes right through the shoulder. This is a grown on sleeve on this t-shirt, and that gives it some stability as well. It stops it from stretching out, and I thought that was a nice touch. And if you look inside some activewear, you'll find that, or some t-shirts, some shop bought t-shirts. So I thought that was a nice touch on there, and you can do that even if your instructions don't tell you to do that. You can do that. So that's just 2 ways of stabilising your shoulder seam. Well, 3 if you include the lip ribbon. But yeah, it's worth doing your shoulder seams at the very least. So my last and final tip, number 10, is sewing hems. I like to use a stabiliser in my hem. It just stops the fabric from moving about a little bit. I know sometimes if you're using twin needles, you can get tunnelling effects and things like that. So some fabrics are worse than others, and that goes back to your testing. So give it a test on whatever your preferred finishing method is on hems. You can use zigzag stitch. I do prefer to use a twin needle if I can. And twin needles do come in different widths as well. So play about and have a test with your different widths. And they also come in ballpoint and non-ballpoint. So just watch out that when you're buying them, that they are actually okay for knits. I've fallen foul of that one before as well. A little bit of stabiliser will stop it from potentially tunnelling. Tunnelling is where you kind of get a ridge between the 2 twin needles. Lengthen your stitch length. Have a play about with your scrap piece of fabric. Use a stabiliser, that should stop it from doing that. And like I say, just really keep testing it before you actually go onto your garment. You don't always have to use a stretch within your hem. So for example, on the skirt of this dress, that's not going to get stretched out at all, so I've just used a straight stitch on there. You don't actually need to do twin needles, or a very, very fine, very long zigzag as well. You can use that. If you're really struggling with your hems or any of your seams, you could consider buying a walking foot for your machine. I tend to avoid using my walking foot simply because it's a faff to put it on, but that could be a good investment if you're really struggling. You can also alter the pressure foot as well, the actual pressure that the pressure foot's putting on. That can also cause a bit of puckering or tunnelling. Again, go back to your machine manual, see if you can alter the pressure of your presser foot. That might help. Have a look at a walking foot, and like I say, I find that the stabiliser serves 2 purposes. So what I do is I insert it a little bit away from the edge of the hem. I then use it as a guide for pressing up, so I get a nice even hem. It gives a nice stable surface for me to sew on, and the fabric doesn't move about quite so much. So I hope you found these hints and tips useful. If you're going to be sewing with any knits, let me know any tips that you've got below as well. I've tried to keep it brief and keep it down to 10. But obviously there's lots of other things. So sewing with neckbands, for example. I've got a tutorial for inserting a V-neck band if you want to have a look at that. And I've also got a tutorial for sewing the Mandy boat tee if it's your very first knit garment. Mandy boat tee is a nice easy one because you don't have a neckband to insert. So if you want to check out either of those videos, along with the one about the sewing machine needles, have a look at those. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching. I shall speak to you later. Bye.